Welcome back to Software Without Borders, where we explore the ever-evolving world of software and its impact on businesses and industries worldwide. I'm your co-host, Andy Hilliard, CEO of Accelerance, and with me today is my co-host, Olivier Poulard, Managing Director of Software Strategies at Accelerance.
Well, thank you, Andy. And today we're thrilled to have Bob Grogan join us. Bob is a highly experienced technology leader and architect with a diverse background spanning various industries from education technology, healthcare, insurance, and retail. Bob's expertise ranges from enterprise and business architecture to cloud architecture and application design. He's also passionate about agile methodologies, and he's a servant. He claims to be a servant leader, so we'll see what that means, and fostering collaboration within teams. So welcome to the show, Bob.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So, Bob, I always like to start the show with a little bit of context about your journey, about your history, just so people have an understanding of how you have evolved over time. So could you share a little bit about your journey from enterprise architecture and the various roles you've held, from application design to cloud architecture?
I've been a software developer since before that was the term, of course, but I converted from manufacturing materials engineering, which was my training, into being a full-time developer a long time ago. After always asking why, always wanting to know how things worked, what we were trying to accomplish, I moved from software development into architecture. Basically, how do you structure something to be successful beyond just writing the code to make it functional? And that just kind of grew from there. When I entered into education technology, that was kind of the pivotal moment when I moved from focusing exclusively on the architecture of the software and more into the architecture of the software and the technology environment in service of the success of the business. I had a very good boss who sought to refine me with some business school education, gave me a much broader background as I entered into leadership positions, first as a director and eventually as a CTO for a couple of smaller companies. And that gave me a much larger perspective on where engineering can be effective, where solution design becomes critical, where your built environment has to influence your decision making, and some of these other more modern approaches to utilizing technology for the business. And as a result, I've been consulting for the past number of years, getting that additional exposure to other industries, other patterns, and then of course adopting cloud and more recently the artificial intelligence adoption from a strategic perspective.
I would imagine that the journey and evolution from being a hands-on developer to having a leadership role in architecture is on the one hand somewhat similar because it's a journey from point A to point B, but for each person it's different. For every single person it's different. So, can you describe some of the evolutionary steps and maybe challenges, your own perspective? What was your journey like moving from one to the other?
Well, I'll say first, the reason that I became a development manager was because my boss was promoted and I didn't want to work for anyone else. And so I left the team that I'd been a part of for 6 years to manage them. And that comes with pluses and minuses that they don't necessarily prepare you for. The first year after that was probably the worst year of my professional life because as a normal evolution from an individual contributor to a manager, your skill set has to adapt. It has to evolve because the expectations of what you produce changes. And that's why I was, again, very fortunate to have that boss who was coaching me, who was educating me to broaden my perspective and say, yep, you didn't write any code today, but you still contributed like I needed you to. And so it was definitely that somewhat traditional, but I also remained technical. And so there was a bit of a tension there, but it definitely broadened my perspective while also deepening my understanding of building solutions.
Yeah, that's what I like about you, Bob, by the way, is the fact that you moved to management, but you remained technical. And I think it's a key thing. If you want to manage your people well, you need to understand what they're doing and how they're doing it. And not just that, but you need to be able to support them and help them the system in case of problems, right? That's really what this is about.
Yeah, but also recognize it isn't necessarily your most senior or your most talented engineer that's going to be your best manager.
That is true.
You may want to cultivate a principal engineer, which again wasn't a thing before, right? You just got enough experience and you naturally became a manager, and that often didn't work out. But it's an aptitude and an attitude, again, that servant leadership aspect that is critical.
So, Olivier, you appreciate that. I also appreciate the fact that your career spans a lot of different industries, from education to healthcare, insurance, and retail. So, can you tell me a little bit about how exposure to these different industries help shape your enterprise architecture approach?
Sure. I was actually asked recently, I was on a panel about AI in the workplace, and a student came up to me afterwards and said, you mentioned that your degree was in physical engineering, as I mentioned, materials science and engineering. Now that you've had a career, would you go back and do something different? My answer was no. Even though my career has been primarily software, the approaches and the understanding of kind of that built environment and the physics behind things, the ability to take big problems and make them into a series of small problems, that's a very engineering kind of mindset that is very helpful. And also, I found that software developers, architects that don't have a more direct industry understanding have a challenge around the suitability of their solutions. And so starting in the manufacturing and like the physical world, and then as I grew into being a manager and a leader, that helped me understand environments that were more human in nature, like insurance, like education, and even like retail and now supply chain specialization, is that you have to understand the user experience, which became a recent discipline, right? And you sort of round out how can software meet the end user and the needs that are there.
Great. Well, I mean, it's you had a very well-rounded journey, and now I'd like to delve a little bit into how this well-rounded accumulation of skills and experiences has led you to managing distributed teams. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. So can you tell me some key considerations for enterprise architects to, let's say, successfully ensure the collaboration and communication across these teams?
Of course. My career, like yours, spans basically the genesis of outsourcing, and the outsourcing companies themselves have matured over time. Fortunately, it went from basically a collection of people with a poor internet connection that were hoping to understand your problem to now you might have an organization that's CMM level 2. And so there's sort of that baseline of credibility that also comes with a certain level of cost. There's a baseline of understanding of the problem space that you're in. If you can have expertise within that other team, that's important. But internally, you have to understand that managing a distributed team is a capability all by itself. If you don't have those same opportunities to sit down and have that one-on-one conversation because there's a vendor involved, especially if there's a vendor that is thousands of miles or dozens of time zones away, you have to recognize that. And it doesn't mean that they're not suitable. It just means that you have to manage them in a slightly different way with slightly different expectations. But at the end of the day, that shared understanding is universal, right? You need that regardless of where your teams are working.
Maybe we could move to something a little bit more technical, I guess, Bob. That's okay with you. So you know that you have a strong background in .NET and Java, but also in cloud technology. So looking at what's going on today with AI and machine learning in general, how do you see these technologies evolving in the enterprise landscape?
There's always been the buy versus build challenge. That's an interesting one, but it's no longer binary. And I think that's the more interesting aspect of it. And I'll break that down in a couple of different ways. The first is while a manufacturer and a supply chain may sort of grow as a company, and then ultimately they're like, now we need an ERP, and that's a symbol that you've arrived. I need an enterprise resource planning system. It's not that automatic anymore, because there are so many SaaS solutions where you could actually get a best of breed, a more modern approach to, say, product lifecycle management or human resources management, rather than assuming that having one central platform is the best option for you. And that's particularly true as you understand the core competencies of what your company does. You don't want a generic solution if it's something that is central to your success as an organization. If you go down below in the technology, and where AI is particularly exciting, because as I'm sure many people have, I picked up Python in the last year. It doesn't mean I'm a Python expert. It means that I can ask AI to write Python code as I would have written it in C Sharp, because Python has the libraries I need, and it will provide me that layer of code, that layer of abstraction that allows me to utilize those libraries. And so where I see the particular opportunity is in legacy software. I actually came across a requirement recently where a company was looking for a developer that knew both COBOL and .NET. And while that's a person I have yet to meet, the more important aspect is it doesn't sound like the company understands what they're trying to accomplish or what's possible with a transpiler and with AI support for a developer who wouldn't touch COBOL as a developer, but might find the use of AI to translate COBOL into .NET a very interesting challenge. And so it's there's the job design, there's the work to be done, and then there's of course the focusing on what are you trying to accomplish. Let's build the best path in that direction.
And talking about legacy applications, so one of the biggest problems that I found was to minimize disruption and business operations, right? So you have that legacy applications going on, it's working well. Of course, we need to replace it because nobody understands COBOL anymore, or this type of, or the architecture could be just not capable of evolving, right? So, but how do you minimize disruptions to business operations when you move from a legacy application to the next gen application?
Well, we developed the strangling vine pattern a while back with cloud services, right? The ability to move portions of a database schema, portions of a service interface, and then integrate or sync back to the legacy system, and just through the patterns in microservices, orchestrate kind of this transition. And that has been, broadly speaking, successful. I think that there are new patterns that are opened up, particularly with AI. For instance, if you need new capabilities that the old system doesn't provide, you may be able to leverage communication with multiple systems in kind of a facade layer that then communicates to the end user, rather than assuming that you need to completely replace the environment. But the other aspect, along with kind of the cloud migration, which is really central to completely managing legacy footprints, is making sure that your user processes are understood. So that even something like, oh, we're going to turn this off and turn this on. All right, well, can we do that in November? No, because that's during the retail hot season. So we have to actually plan our IT cycle around not disrupting Black Friday, right? And making it a more holistic conversation so that you can manage the disruption more effectively. There are other patterns I can go on, but well, yes, there's a lot of opportunity there.
Absolutely, I clearly remember working in the retail environment, and those timelines are important. If they miss the quarter 3 and 4 of the year, that's it. They're done for the year, right? So
yeah. Well, in education, it's even tighter. You have the end of the normal school year in one part of the country, and you have the start of the next school year in a different part of the country, and then you have Christmas break. Those are your release windows. So yeah, it was challenging planning for sure.
Yeah, there was another one with the airlines, for instance. It's not as prevalent in the US, but in Europe, for instance, ski season is important. So
off to
only
Innsbruck.
we have, we could not make any modifications around Christmas because of the world in general, but around the February, March, April timeframe, depending on the Easter holiday and that kind of stuff, we could not make any changes. So we had to freeze the environment just for certain countries in Europe because, especially the UK, because the UK, they have to fly to those mountains, right? Whereas the rest of Europe, they can just drive. So that was I think consideration. Yeah.
I think that all brings up another very interesting part of distributed teams, because if you can actually blend local knowledge with your technical capabilities, then you get better decisions up and down the chain as well.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, in fact, a question about distributed teams. So, and then I'll come back to something else that I absolutely wanted to ask you. But just so that I don't forget, how can enterprise architecture help bridge the gaps in distributed teams, especially when working on complex projects? Not the simple stuff, but the more complex ones. So, what is the effect on a good enterprise architecture?
Well, one of the foundational pieces that often gets a bad rap because of how it was managed previously is application portfolio management. And this is where it crosses into kind of the business architecture, where the enterprise needs to understand its capabilities and its alignment of systems to those capabilities. There's importance around cost and other sort of more mundane aspects, but it's really fundamental to change management. We need to do product lifecycle management better. So we're going to introduce new systems and tools to do that. All right. Do we actually understand all of the systems and tools that currently participate in product lifecycle management within our organization? That's where an enterprise architect is critical. If you introduce a distributed team because you need custom software built for some segment of this lifecycle management, having that holistic view that actually says, okay, here's the link in the chain where this software participates. Here's the typical inputs. Here's the typical outputs. Not at like an ID data cell level, but this is the part of the process where you are building us new capabilities. And it is critical to developing that shared understanding. Because again, ultimately, you can define requirements, you can provide user stories, but you really want the developers to understand the problem they're trying to solve in any way that you can.
So then it leads to my the last section of my little section here on technology is, can you give us maybe a story about a successful digital transformation initiative that you led?
I can give a couple, but what I will talk about is in education, as there was a mobile adoption. There was Flash was central to education technology for a long, long time for curriculum, and everybody knows the watershed moment where Flash was over. Right? Apple said, "Nope, we're not letting that happen on the iPad." At the same time, they sold a tremendous number of iPads to schools. So being a part of an education technology curriculum company at that time was incredibly challenging. Well, we had a lot of schools that suddenly had resources to educate their children that couldn't actually run any of the curriculum that they had published. So we had to do this in phases because the other aspect about education, of course, is your product is a child, and so your raw materials are changing every year. So one of the funny things that we would get from field sales was a child would show up and they would reach for the computer screen and wonder why nothing changed when they touched the computer screen. So we had to look at it from a mitigation perspective, right? Here's the administrative work that you can use the iPads for. Here is the non-Flash-based curriculum, and how can we segment that to support the teacher throughout their workday? Because a lot of education technology had been really isolated from up to that point. And so we were looking at getting into more the core classroom, and this is where the transformation story begins. We had to look at mitigation technology, which was was broadcasting of Flash content and Flash interaction to iPads where it was acceptable. Could we, downscale the video quality or other aspects to support this period of transition? And then, of course, the real project, the architectural project, was how do we migrate the legacy curriculum that we had to HTML5, assuming that was an acceptable transition, or to video, or to, what we had to define, really deconstruct our instructional design perspective to support the classroom workflow and to support future technology advances. So that was a tremendous project. It was a multi-year effort because we had such a large curricular code base, but it ultimately produced a far better product. Led to additional analytics. It led to additional interactions. Supported some of the trends within education more broadly. So it was generally a success.
And it led to happy kids and educators.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. If you don't produce the results, then the teachers don't use it, and the kids aren't happy, and that's what's gratifying about it as well.
Yeah.
Speaking about education and making a slight leap, so I know that you do some part-time adjunct professorship at the University of St. Thomas in digital supply chain management. What sort of led you there, and what have you learned, or how has that augmented your own professional capabilities?
Sure. Well, I came to supply chain like most people through COVID. I was aware of logistics. I was aware of the data challenges in warehouse management systems and some sort of those nuts and bolts pieces. But the consulting company that I was working for at the time, we just started getting an increasing number of 3PL, of supply chain, of around analytics, around distribution, all of these different challenges. Because supply chain as a discipline evolved in such an unusual way, absent technology. My favorite term was 85% of the supply chain runs on Excel. That's the usual tooling. Even if there's a database that exists, you pull it out, you put it into your Excel, and then you get the answer, right? And so that became a domain of interest to me. I went to a supply chain conference. Happened to meet the incoming dean, talked about my perspective. He just happened to have a professor who was on sabbatical and needed a course taught that was less supply chain focused and more technology focused. And he felt that the department needed more technology exposure for the students because that's what the market was telling him. That's what the employers that had been hiring his graduates were telling him, was that they didn't have enough of that enterprise systems level sophistication. And so they really needed that background in addition to the supply chain side. So that's what connected me last year, developed the curriculum for the course, did a tremendous amount of research into the variations, the important aspects. And then I'm in the middle of it again this year, co-teaching with another professor, and we'll be taking it over going forward. If I can continue the second part of your question, if that wasn't too long, the one of the most interesting parts is that it has given me another mental model for design, because the architecture, the global movement of information is really a functional supply chain. And so you actually have a lot of these mechanics, a lot of these analogies and methodologies in supply chain that help to design architectures that meet service levels and resilience and redundancy in economically appropriate ways. So that's what I'll say about that.
Yeah, I think when all of us accumulate a certain amount of experience and expertise, I don't know many people that don't have some sort of driving desire to impart that to others. I don't know what it's a human condition, I guess. And so I really appreciate people that are actively involved in assimilating new information and then imparting or disseminating information back to others. And that's how people interact, and that's how people, build relationships. Now, I was just talking about how you impart information, but what are you doing to actively assimilate new information around emerging trends like AI and machine learning?
Well, I've been to a couple of conferences that were very AI focused, but mainly it's honestly it's podcasts in the morning because I learn from the podcast, but more importantly, I learn the things that I need to go research based on the conversations that are had on the podcasts. So I've gotten so many leads, whether it's economics or it's technology or what have you, new products that have been developed. Because it eventually all kind of has to make sense together, and so that's what I do. I'll listen to the conversation. I'll try and understand the root of what they're talking about, but then also try and understand how it works at a technical level, and then go do the research to sort of build my understanding of that. And of course, being able to ask AI for just kind of those starting points, and have that conversation that leads me to the primary sources is hugely helpful as well.
Yeah, I don't know. Everyone's different, and I know my media and social media and frankly probably human interaction consumption has gone way down with the advent of Gen AI. It was honestly built for Andy Hilliard, I think. As a kid, I grew up reading the encyclopedia backwards and forwards, world books, and then almanacs, and then world record books, because I wanted to know a little bit about everything, and it was just so addictive. And then the life happened, and all of a sudden Gen AI came, and my wife literally has to say, you got to just stop and come to bed. And I'm just like, there's too much to learn.
Too much to know. Yeah.
And you can interact with it so much.
Well, yeah, just the fact that I've got Perplexity as my search tool. So you don't have to try and discern sources and, work your way through the ads and all of the clickbait, and you can just get a thing that gets you an answer, because sometimes you want a deep search. Sometimes you want to research a topic. Sometimes you just want to know who was in that movie, right? And you don't have to go to a website to get it. So,
my percentages of, well, it used to be Google 100%, but now it's Gemini, 90% and Google maybe 10%. I don't know.
Yeah.
Also, I want to touch upon servant leadership and collaboration. I'm a huge believer in servant leadership. I think, actually, I'm not going to define what I think servant leadership is and how I deploy it. I want to find out from you. How do you define servant leadership and collaboration, and how do you foster a culture of innovation and collaboration?
Well, the evidence is all but incontrovertible at this point, where if you invest in your people, you will get better results. There's no top-down management philosophy, no organizational structure, no economic incentives that will get people to do their best work. Investing in your people to do their best work gets your best results. And it's, it's a thing that should be obvious. And yet we still have plenty of companies and managers that harken back, and have kind of very much lost sight of that, obvious
because
connection.
Everyone wants what they want, but they don't understand how to get it. And they phrase things in "I want" as opposed to "what do you need," knowing that I'm going to get what I want by serving you.
Yeah. And I think the return to office conversation was an unfortunate exemplar of that. I honestly thought bosses still had the upper hand. I thought they would just eventually say, come back to the office or you're not working here anymore. And there was just so much pent up demand to not do that, to not go back to the 5 days a week of commuting. Wow. There was so much investment on individual employees' part that everybody just kind of said, no, that's just not going to happen, because it's not actually meeting the needs. And that's where the servant leadership comes in. It's like, yes, we have to accomplish things for the business. That's why I'm paying you. But we also have to respect it's not a work-life balance as kind of this neat segmentation. It is, how do you do your best work? how do you get the outcomes that I have assigned you effectively, right? If I'm not giving you challenging work, why would I expect phenomenal results, right?
Sure.
It's this partnership that actually creates the value ultimately, and you set the context, and that's where the hybrid model was always going to be the right way. You can't have half your team in Vanuatu and the other half in Seattle and just sort of hope they work together, right? You have to structure it in a way. You have to have collaboration. You have to have processes and tools that support the collaboration intentionally, not just free form, and not just ultimately we all have to be in the same room or we're not doing anything.
It seems like in the last few years, because of this new world we live in of distributed work, and then the onslaught of tools and new best practices on how to communicate, that we're still going through a rapid learning stage of how to do this well. So, what strategies do you use to effectively communicate, let's say, complex technical concepts to business stakeholders and make sure that you align technology and business goals?
That's a passion project of mine. Honestly,
it's so hard.
Yeah,
I hope you figured it out.
I hope to eventually, especially when you're coming in as a consultant. That just sort of adds that additional dimension. But I can give a story about a recent contract, which we had a global manufacturer that had a directive from the top. We want more analytics. We want more understanding of our manufacturing best practices. They had sales best practices. They had analytics around, revenue and things like that. And they really believed they needed more data in a centralized place in order to be more successful. The company grew through acquisition, which meant you may have had 32 global sites under one umbrella, but you had some that are large, some that are small. They specialize in different areas. And so they felt that there was a missing best practice element there that they could gain through data. A perfectly understandable business case. But when you started digging into how each individual plant operated, where it was consistent, where it was not consistent, it revolved around particularly a SQL server that was getting overloaded. And they wanted to move everything from there to a centralized data lake platform. So basically, all of their manufacturing systems would then report to a central organization, and then the operational data would flow back, and the analytics data would be aggregated beyond that. Well, nobody had sort of done the napkin math on the one hand around the costs of moving all of that data. They hadn't done the practical math of understanding whether the speed of light was supportable at the rate that they needed the responsiveness to run the manufacturing facility. They hadn't done the analysis of the benefits to the end users. They had 101 things they called data products, which is great. But when I said, okay, who are the customers for these products? Nobody knew the answer within the technology area. And so what sort of just pushing a little bit on this got us to was the ability to segment, we don't need real-time operational data feeding our analytics. That doesn't do us any good. That's the most expensive data stream. That's the one that's most challenging from a technology perspective and the most costly. Let's leave the operational data at local to the plant. We can ship that anytime and learn over time and start really breaking apart this monolithic problem. We've got 101 things. Let's move them from here to here into something that was more consumable for the business, but then also more consumable for the engineers. They had been given, we need sub-second latency. Okay, well, maybe we can buy this. Maybe we can deploy this, right? They immediately started with the how can we solve within the constraints conversation. And I was able to pull that back to, where do these constraints actually live? What are the broader constraints that we're operating within? Who are we trying to analyze this data for? And that ultimately was the bridge between. And it's that kind of analysis where I think my background, I think my technical and leadership capacities make me beneficial as a member of the team.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's interesting. And so my next question would be to you, how do you balance that technical expertise with leadership responsibilities?
It's not easy.
No.
But it's also where you really get into the heart of Agile, right? The heart of Agile is that psychological safety, the element of trust, which comes in a couple of different forms. It comes in the blameless retrospective aspect. It comes in the understanding that you have the forming, norming, and storming and norming of teams, which means that you can't expect ultimate productivity 2 sprints in, right? But it also comes in to mutual respect and understanding of what each member brings to the team, right? I don't write code on a daily basis, but I have seen an awful lot of code. And so I don't want to impugn or otherwise affront like a technical leader who is dedicated to the team, who's responsible for the output. But I do want to be able to have one-on-one conversations with that person as we think about the solutions. So you have to balance your communication strategies. You have to balance, what your limitations are, and along with, the context in order to get the best results.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So, then, okay, so can you tell us, okay, so based on all this, what you've learned throughout your career and, what you've learned through your career from a leadership standpoint, from a technical standpoint. You mentioned change management earlier. I could add problem management or problem solving.
Iterate early and often. That's one key. But the most meaningful book that I've read recently is one called How Big Things Get Done. And it codified a lot of the thoughts that I have had over my career. But the author actually has a large database of projects ranging from home renovation to the Sydney Opera House, right? And has analyzed the patterns of success and the patterns of failure. And so the first, what that recommendation was, definitely find ways to do low risk things and don't move forward just to make it feel like you're acting. Make sure that you understand your forward motion as much as possible. And that's the Pixar example, where they'll spend 2 years storyboarding the story and displaying it to internal audiences and refining it. That's not seen as wasted time, right? It's not seen as production delay. It's seen as a cautious investment to know if the movie's worth making, if the story's worth telling. But the other side is respect the expertise and the wisdom. As the U.S. has started to develop nuclear power plants for the first time in 50 years, they've actually found people who were retired from the nuclear industry and brought them onto these new projects, because the closer you can get the expertise to the problem that you're trying to solve, the better off you're going to be. And don't imagine that your organization is special, right? You're going to do it in half the time because we're great. Right? These projects have been done, and whether it's an ERP or it's a bridge or whatever, there are examples, and they take what they take, and you have to respect that. You have to leverage expertise of people who have been through it to get the right expectations, to get the best results.
I think you've been kind of talking about this the last couple of minutes, but I'm going to phrase it in a slightly different angle, and that is looking at enterprise architecture yesterday, today, and maybe over the next 10 years. What do you see are the challenges or maybe changes that will be happening?
So I'm all about internal contradiction here, right? I really like Agile, but I also really like enterprise architecture.
Yeah.
The rise of Agile, I'm sad to say, has led to the decline of architecture in terms of respect and thought leadership. But unfortunately, architects sowed the seeds of that themselves, right? We're going to buy an enterprise architecture tool. We're going to establish governance. And 3 years later, we now finally have the catalog of all of the systems that are present. And we have a review board that takes 6 months to get on the calendar, right? That's not an accomplishment. And so there's reasons that people started leaning on agile methodology in place of some of these traditional approaches. Of course, as I'm sure you two know as well, that's a way to make an app, right? That's a way to run a startup, but it's not a way to adjust the Sabre system that underlines every airline reservation, right? There's a certain level of stability. There's a level of downstream impact. There's all of these things that you have to take into account when you're making significant modifications to established systems. And so I think that from my career in particular, I've seen a lot of different waves, and I think a lot of things have changed for the better. I think the timing of this generative AI is great, because it takes a lot of that really mundane work that you needed to do to have a legitimate APM tool, right? An application portfolio management tool was a really challenging thing to construct across an enterprise. Well, you can get a good enough APM using generative API and generative AI in a much shorter time frame. And so you can have much more sophisticated and valuable conversations instead of focusing on, was that written in Java 8 or Java 9, right? Which is where a lot of the dotting the I's and crossing the T's of EA has been. So I see in the next few years, as more people appreciate the importance, and as some of the practitioners appreciate the need for getting things done, AI being that kind of bridge that supports them moving forward faster, and then also supports some of the wisdom that has been accumulated influencing this generation of engineering leadership. That's my hope, anyway.
So what you're saying is that AI and ML are playing a huge role in shaping the future of enterprise architecture, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, as we've seen, the success rates of modern data science projects, modern digital transformation projects, they're not good. And the reason that they are not as good as they could be is the human factor. If you don't manage the business process, the change management, allow for organizational and job redesign as you're digitally transforming, if you don't have that in mind, just introducing systems and tools is not going to help the situation. And that's where I kind of view AI as a certain humanizing of technology, right? IT is all about the bits and bytes, and it better do the same thing that it did last week, this week, with the same inputs and, all of these sort of managed qualities. Whereas the business leadership is like, what should our strategy be? How many people should I hire? I don't know. How are sales going? What's it likely to be, right? And they're dealing in ambiguity every day. And so if you can put a more humanizing interface in this AI form on top of your data-driven, your data-managed systems, and again, hope, but I'm hoping that helps to bridge the conversation.
Yeah, and in the end, transformation is not just about technology, and that's the key. Transformation, you need to take into account the business process, the operations or their processes. You need to take into account the end user, the customers, etc., right? And you need to take into the human aspect of it is important as well. And if you're just digitizing things, it is not a digital transformation. So taking a piece of paper on a computer doesn't mean that you've done any transformation at all. You just transposed, a media for another, or a medium for.
That's very, very true. And just to call back, right? If technology looks threatening, your people will undermine your efforts. If you don't engage people in what the future looks like, then you're chasing your tail. But I think the best practical example that I have anyway is the idea of cryptocurrency. Right? There are believers, there are skeptics, and no judgment. But the idea that cryptocurrency somehow digitizes money just isn't true, right? The Visa debit card digitized money, and it was because the process of carrying around cash and writing checks and all of these problems with traditional monetary transactions were alleviated by this digital thing. it wasn't something wrong with the dollar. It was something wrong with managing all that paper. And
well, hey, Bob, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Your insights into enterprise architecture, leadership, and navigating the complexities of modern software development were really incredibly valuable. I appreciate that. And if the episode, subscribe to our show and leave a 5-star rating, only a 5-star rating, on your favorite podcasting platform. Join us next time for more conversation about software innovation and its transformative impact.